Yeah. The better me.
Okay, welcome to the UCLIC seminar series. Look at this, we've got some branding going on now. So excited. Great to see you all here. So really delighted to welcome Minha coming over from Eindhoven. And I'm just going to pass the ball over. There we go.
Thank you
Get
for
on.
the invite. Yeah, thanks, Duncan. So I'm here to have a discussion with you about, of course, ethics and HCI, but how HCI as a discipline could help ethics in the 21st century. And I do that with a series of examples. And the topic here is on exploring moral implications of collaborative mind perception, in which collaboration doesn't always have to be, per se, a positive thing. I've been told I'm a mutt. I've been also accused of being a psychologist. That part isn't true. I am a mutt, though. I studied philosophy first and then moved on to digital animation before actually diving into HCI in my master's. And I did get, some psych training in my PhD. And I work in industrial design now. So that's the full spectrum. I've definitely traveled my way around. And yeah, in the industrial design department, we are approaching ethics slightly differently than what you might have in mind. So let's get into it. Let's define it first. So why interactional morality? Because we need to really think of ethics as situated. And many people have definitely said that, but we don't really look into the details of the interaction. So I see it as an interplay between a person and a machine, and this person being me as a toddler, within a particular situation of trying to feed this rock baby some chips, because I thought it has to be hungry because I'm hungry and I need to eat potato chips. So I definitely assume things about this rock baby based on my perception. So it does involve how we are reflected in the machine or non-human other. And in interactional morality, what I think we have overlooked is the role of what are called artificial emotions. They can be artificially generated tears or expressions from, your virtual agent, but also we express it in our daily lives as well, right? We lie with our emotions, laugh when something actually isn't that funny, for instance, and we attribute emotions and project emotions that are not existing in other people's minds because, we feel them, right? If I'm angry, maybe the world just does feel angry as well. And this interest started with the paper on caring for Vincent, in which the Vincent bot had this care receiving feature in which it would say things like, oh, I was so afraid to walk through that door that I turned around and walked away when it was late to a meeting with other chatbots. And it would tell people, well, I was so embarrassed. Am I the dumbest bot you've ever seen? And, users, people knowing that it's just a mere bot would still say, well, it can happen to anybody. Don't worry. Be proud of the bot that you are. And we found out that, well, giving this sort of compassion elicited self-compassion in people who interacted with Vincent. But of course, in our day-to-day commercial interactions with conversational user interfaces, be it Alexa, Siri, or ChatGPT, they mainly deal with simple categories of emotion, right? They understand things like happiness or sadness. They know how to use emojis. But they're not really reaching the level of being able to understand or interact with moral emotions. Heck, even with humans, it's hard to talk about compassion. When's the last time you asked a friend, like, when's the last time you felt compassionate or grateful? Like, it's not a normal everyday thing to talk about moral emotions. So I became interested in maybe how we can design conversations through and with technology for and about our moral emotions. I got up to gratitude, and compassion, so all the good stuff. I didn't really make my way down towards more negative emotions like shame and guilt. I don't know. Eventually, I'll try to get there. And one thing that really stands out is that obviously emotions are socially constructed, right? And this is where we know that emotions are improvised, right? I am trying to remain, happy and friendly because I am giving this talk, right? And you have to also play the role of an audience, and we have these improvisations as emotional characteristics. And one thing that I ask if, if emotions are then socially constructed between humans, humans and machines, then how do you think CUIs should be designed? CUIs here being conversational user interfaces. So they design us back, and we need to be thinking about how we aspire to feel, right? So because there is such ambiguity on who feels what, if we are at let's say a concert and we are all in awe of each other through music, then we don't really ask who owns that emotion, right? The crowd is just in awe, right? You express gratitude towards the musicians, you share those emotions. But somehow, when we talk about machine others, we feel like there's something to protect, right? That I am the one who feels compassion, not this Vincent chatbot, right? Like, so why do we kind of allow for that ambiguity between human beings in sharing emotions, but not necessarily with machine others? But the better question could be perhaps, how can we design CUIs or other machines to co-feel, right? To also evolve our emotional experiences. We already do that. We pick the music we want to listen to that changes our emotions. Why can't we sort of upgrade that through AI? Importantly, this allows us to also take mind perception seriously, because we sort of assume, yeah, these bots are smart, right? Cognitively so, but they can't be emotional. And I wanted to maybe play around with that notion a bit more, because if we say that you are able to be agentic because you can practice planning and goal-directed behavior, you can also be a morally capable agent who is able to do morally relevant things to other people or things. But patiency, being able to suffer, for instance, being able to feel, allows you to be a moral patient, the recipient of the moral action of the other. And to be perceived to have a mind, you need both agency and patiency. The original scale calls this experience, but I prefer to call it patiency to showcase the dichotomy. And by allowing for mind perception in its full scale, well, we hope that I have grown from this toddler who feeds rocks to, this person in front of you. I would like to believe that I have matured, not sure. And we can also differentiate like an ATM from a child. Of course, the child is slightly more emotional than the ATM, I'd like to believe. And we have Spock as well, who's not an ATM, definitely not, but also not me with my emotional as well as cognitive sensibilities. So I used mind perception to look into, well, can we overturn this immediate bias or perception? And what can we put into the situation so that we slowly see a change in how we attune to low versus high agency, for instance? So I manipulated the context for a machine to express its agency, whether it's high or low, through 2 studies with 3 games: Dictator, Ultimatum, and Negotiation. So in the Dictator game, you just tell the machine, this is the offer. That's it, I'm the dictator. And in the Ultimatum game, the machine just could say no, they could reject it. And in the Negotiation, they could negotiate across different items. So it goes from a very simple model to a more, let's say complex model of a negotiation in which both sides would have to display some understanding of the other party's mind. And we actually did the studies and found out that actually in the Dictator game, the ATM scored the worst, of course, like big surprise. And then in the Ultimatum game, it's about as expected, as Spock did quite well. But in the negotiation, that's when things started to get really weird, because people were trying to figure out what's going on with this machine that talks like an ATM or like a child, but is doing very smart behaviors. It's trying to negotiate items with me, but it's either using baby talk or it's talking like an ATM, right? And they were trying to figure out why this let's say contrast was happening. So they didn't really pay attention to negotiating at all. They're more interested in, why is this ATM or baby trying to outdo me when it's not supposed to, based on my assumption. And so if the context is changed, people's perception of the other agent's minds also becomes changed. It's not the agent in itself. And that was more on the cognition and agency side of it, but also the patiency, emotion side of it should be assessed, right? Do we hold robots morally accountable based on our idea of their artificial emotions? Why is this important? Because, sorry, but robots do get bullied and they get attacked, right? The Pierre robot, I think it's this one, right? It was in Korea, of all places. It got attacked by teenagers, right? Like it was just trying to do its job, telling people where to go, but it got bullied and attacked. And this hitchbot had, much worse fate. Like it got hijacked while it was hitchhiking, and then I think they beheaded it or something, and they found it in some ditch in the US, like really terrible. Like why go through all the effort to kind of punish this robot for just hitchhiking? Not sure. So because this is happening, of course, I jumped on the bandwagon. I did also the trolley dilemma study as well. Sorry, I did. And I guess by now this doesn't need further introduction, right? So, the question I was interested in is, should a robot sacrifice one life to save more lives? Robots are usually expected to be utilitarian actors. So, when a human does it, something doesn't feel right, but as a robot, you should make a utilitarian choice. At least that's what literature suggests. And we had the robot say, well, it didn't do it. I didn't do what I should have done in this coal mine. I didn't really do my utilitarian act. And we had one robot that said it was sorry and that it felt very bad and guilty, and it looked down, displaying all the emotional behavior. And the other robot just told the facts of like, yes, this happened, and maybe I could have saved more lives. Like no sorry, no emotional behavior. And using mind perception theory across 3 studies in the US and in the Netherlands, we found out actually the interesting thing is that the robot that acted in an emotional way was always ranked as also smarter, right? So, or more agentic, right? So an emotional robot's behavior is important because it impacts both perceived patiency as well as agency, right? So a robot displaying emotional awareness, like knowledge of guilt, for instance, accentuates its agentic capacity as well, right? So that's never really separate. So an emotional robot is therefore perceived as smarter, not necessarily more emotional. And why does that actually matter? Because we find out that, well, with moral accountability, using agency and patiency together, a robot can be blamed and punished like people. And there are issues like the responsibility gap. When many people in a pipeline make this laptop or any robot, it's not just one person, who should actually be blamed if a self-driving car hits a person? And there's also the retributive gap in that, well, who should actually be punished if this self-driving car, again, kills a person, but we can't put the car in a compound or in jail? It doesn't make any sense. So punishment doesn't mean anything, right? But do people assign blame and punishment? They do. And in the series of 3 studies, we see that a robot is perceived to be definitely logical, and we can intentionally make moral decisions with agency, but everybody said a robot cannot make moral decisions emotionally. That's totally fine. Up to that, I get the story. But we also see that people were more likely to punish, right? Punish the one that was not emotional, but not blame it. So a non-emotional robot compared to an emotional robot was punished more often. And that's really strange, right? Because when we talk about blame and punishment with other people, you don't think about punishment before blame, right? So what purpose does it serve? We're kind of skipping a step with a robot. You could say this is what we see with psychopaths, right? So psychopaths kind of are parasitic on moral emotions they don't actually feel, but they pretend to have something like guilt or compassion, right? And so with the parasitic nature of how it displays emotions in this fake way, maybe it avoids punishment. And people are trying to punish a robot that is non-emotional because they're trying to signal to other people. The robot doesn't get what it did, but I'd like to signal to all of you that its behavior was wrong, right? So it's signaling to others in the moral community what is right and not right, based on emotions again. It's important to keep in mind, though, that we have dehumanized other people for having the wrong kind of emotions. This is yeah, apparently a crazy woman, according to Darwin. And I just like wake up like this every day, right? But that's how people thought crazy women were like. I don't know. So we regularly dehumanize other people for being too robotic, like Spock, or being too emotional, right? You know, where's your rationality? This is a non-emotional decision, right? Like, so we dehumanize each other all the time based on emotions. And when does it become problematic when robots or machines enter the scene? Well, this is where you can actually be critical of this collaborative mind perception. I already said that interactional morality is an interaction between a person and a machine in a particular situation. But how will multi-actor interplay change mind perception? How do we regulate each other and read each other's minds when it's no longer a dyadic interaction? I've only been really looking at dyadic interaction so far. So let's define what a group is, right? A group is an intact social system, and then it has boundaries and interdependence between people, like you guys in one department, for example. And you know, people have some shared purpose or goal, but everybody has their own member roles. And in such conditions, robot classmates or teammates can actually be excused or exempt from participating. It's important to note that. You can excuse a robot by saying, well, it didn't know the rules, right? But you can also exempt them by saying, well, it's not a person, so you cannot take a robot seriously. We do that with other humans, maybe children, right? You know, the child doesn't know the rules, or it's exempt from knowing the adult-like moral behavior. And I think robots will also be treated in the same way. This is at least what research shows, right? They're not developed enough. You might get angry at your laptop, but you know, it can't be agentic, right? So maybe I am really only punishing it and not blaming it. And again, when we look at group behavior, it's important to think about who is actually influencing whom then, right? We have one-to-one conversation with a chatbot and a human, right? Joa Ice in China. But a bot can be embedded in human worlds, right? And this is research from Searing, in which the baby bot was trained on Twitch. Like people could train it to maybe mature it, like to learn social norms of a Twitch community. So many people were training one chatbot. It can be many-to-many interactions with a robot or a chatbot guides telling you stories about the local places to go to many different people. But it can actually be more, let's say, visible as celebrity bots, in which millions of people train this chatbot Tay. I'm sure you've heard of it. It was on Twitter until it became very racist because people were trolling it, really, and they had to take it down. Makes a lot of sense. And we see celebrity bots, for example, on Instagram, like Little Miquela has millions of followers, definitely more than me, right? And then it poses itself as a bot, like it doesn't pretend that it's a human, right? But all the images are carefully curated, and it really takes on this Gen Z flavor of living this party life with some ridiculous outfits. It's super great. So these kind of celebrity bots are becoming more common. So all of these interactions are very different from each other, right? And we already know that bots are not welcome, right? Installed Donut on our, department Slack, and people slammed it. They didn't like it. Software developers don't really like bots helping out all the time. They just get in the way sometimes. Machines can help in other ways. They can also mitigate conflict, right? We see both in software engineering and in our own research that when things get kind of difficult and awkward between humans, some people actually want a bot to intervene and ask for Bob's lost cup. Bob, random person's name, has lost his cup and doesn't know where it is. And after asking 10 times and nobody answers him, for example, on WhatsApp, he just said, well, I would prefer a bot to go to each person and ask on my behalf because humans are not responding to me. So machines are being seen as these mediators in human conflicts. And of course, I know that I'm not the first to talk about the symbiosis or collaboration between humans and non-humans, right? We see this work with Ackerman that, in situations that involve both people and non-humans, we have to look at the actors as implicit and explicit actors, right? Not all roles are very visible, right? The main difference, though, is that we're going from mediation to something quite beyond it. I don't know if you know, Dutch philosopher Verbeek, he talks about technological mediation. And before, it used to be that I, as a self, would interact with technology in order to talk to other people, right? I use my phone, my social media to reach other people. However, right now, we see that technology is another you. It's something that we interact with in second-person pronouns, right? Be it an Alexa, IoT, ChatGPT, your robot vacuum cleaner, right? People name these entities. So yes, of course, we still have social media platforms. And as you saw, like celebrity bots are on Instagram, they exist. And so they're in our real, so-called real and virtual worlds, be it social media or, cleaning our offices, right? So in voice user interface, what is interesting is that our querying behavior also changes. Rather than just typing on Google, like pizza place nearby, people are using full sentences like, hey, Google, where's the pizza place near me? We're putting our first person pronouns in all of the queries that we have. So search becomes very different. It definitely becomes conversational. And therefore, when we talk to technology like we talk to other people, the way we display and interact with others emotionally changes. So this is why I'm changing the vision of, let's say, artificial emotions to say that actually artificial emotions don't really exist on their own, right? All emotions are socially constructed. So if I'm being influenced by the celebrity bot to dye my hair or something, for instance, then it's something that we're combining my genuine emotions with, right? So technology has always influenced us, but with AI, with other things that are sort of catered to your technology or your personality more on Instagram or Twitter, we are being affected in different ways that we don't actually realize. I'll end with 3 complications. One is the notion of shared identity, right? So for instance, people share their GitHub accounts with a bot, right? So it's not just me, Minha, and my bot friend as 2 separate entities. Online, people are merging identities between themselves and their bots who are sort of their assistants, right? So you share this identity already in workplaces. The second complication is sort of the moving identity problem, in which I have so far just one body, right? And I don't really go outside of my body. But with technology, we see, of course, your voice user interface transferring to another device, right? Siri is not just on your, let's say, wrist anymore. It can transfer to one body from another. It's very common. So identities are traveling across different devices all the time. And of course, there's the fake identity problem, right? I'm not sure if you know, but these people are not real. It's quite easy to generate realistic profiles, for example, on LinkedIn of people who do not exist. So the growth in fake identities and deepfakes are a huge problem. So then the question you could ask is, if we are to live and work with bots and humans sharing the identity, or bots moving identities, as well as fake legal identities or fake genetic identity even, of all these humans and machines collaborating, what kind of research agenda do we actually need? And do we need to be less optimistic than I have presented the transition from artificial to socially constructed emotions to be? And that's what I would like to maybe discuss with you, and end with some things that I need to promote. We have the continuing workshop on robot identity. It's at HRI this year, and we have a special session on this at Roman to explore what kind of impacts an identity technology has on us, as well as different kind of identities of machines we can imagine, as well as, of course, kui et kai on trust. Can we actually trust all of these kuis and different devices? Maybe not. As well as being more critical about us as researchers, right? HCI research in sensitive settings is a course in which we, really reflect on our positionality as researchers. And do we really need to push for something like participatory design? Is that even enough? So I will end with that and say that in making room for others, machines and other humans, we should not forget ourselves and include our emotions in the picture. Thank you.
Amazing, really great, thank you. Well, lots of time for questions and discussion. I think I still need some time to process, but I'm opening the floor up if anyone wants to take. As always, talking to the magic shell, not for amplification, but for the people online. Thank you.
Thank you. As Duncan said, there's quite a lot to unpack, and I'm going to take the cheap way, and I'm going to ask you to do that. Can you tell us more about you had one slide where there was the dictator game, the ultimatum game, and negotiation.
Mhm.
That is something I find really interesting. I've been looking at ultimatum game, something that never had time to, or never had the chance to submit. Or get accepted, actually. That was a while ago. Can you tell us more about what you actually, what was the study, what you show participants? Did you have 4 bots? I didn't quite understand. I mean, I understand that you were like giving us just a very broad overview, but I'm really curious about knowing more about the details.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So indeed, I created 4 different bots based on the squares you saw, right? One that sort of talked like a human adult, at least modeled after me, and an ATM version that would just say like, yes, grant accepted, right? Very much like withdrawing money from an ATM. And we had a Spock that talked in a Spock-like way, and the child condition that just said, I want this one, you know, I want that candy.
So was it text?
Yes, it was text, and there was an avatar, right, that would change. So it was very minimally manipulated. So that was what we tested. And then we had just description of what the dictator game is. And then, you know, given this set of characters, you know, depending on the condition, like what would you give it, right, out of this many tickets? And the negotiation was more involved, right? They really had to have a dialogue in order to negotiate over various items in a restricted time.
And how did the bot take the decision? Was it like Wizard of Oz, or was it actually computational?
So the negotiation, yes, right? But then the thing is,
Even the ultimatum game?
no, only the negotiation. So an ultimatum and dictator games were just descriptions, like how much would you give it, knowing that it's got these characteristics.
Okay, so
It was minimal. Yeah.
So people did not interact with the bot. They only...
No, they really only saw, you know,
A
the
depiction of it.
condition.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry to disappoint, but only in the negotiation they were really interacting in this conversational manner.
And was that Wizard of Oz, or was that computational?
No, that it was actually computational.
And how did the bot decide what?
So it didn't behave in any different way. So across all 4 conditions, it negotiated in the same exact way, right? And so it wasn't, trained to do anything smart, quite essentially, right? But it was only the way that it was talking to participants that happened to be different.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? I think you were
And can you
to
tell us again? I mean, I know you mentioned it in the first time around, but what did you find?
Yeah, so basically, so we find the negotiation, I think, is the most interesting because they performed really badly with sort of the child agent and the ATM agent.
What's badly?
So they scored lower. They scored lower than the agent they were up against, right? So they lost the negotiation, essentially.
Okay.
Right, and when they were actually paired with Spock-like character or human adult, then they outperformed the agent. But they did worse compared to the childlike robot or bot and the ATM. Because I think, and this is the assumption, right? That's sort of like discussion implication on why it happened. But they were too busy trying to figure out what was going on. And it just seemed a bit uncanny to them, I think. I think that would be my explanation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Picking up on towards the end there when you were talking about I'm not going to use the same elegance that you were phrasing it, but essentially the kind of who is the agent you're talking to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it comes up in so many ways. It's like it feels sometimes with these ChatGPT conversations, you have to start over again every single time because you want to kind of like reframe. You don't want to rejoin the same chat, but you want to
Yeah.
kind of, you always have to remind it who you are, what the basics are, so to speak. And then also the kind of moving around, yeah, the diving around, like Siri is a good example. Like we said, hey, I won't say the name, but you know, there'd be a whole bunch of them that would respond now, and it's like who you're talking. So yeah, I think that it really is this kind of identity, the moving identity, all of it. So yeah, the next stuff is super, super interesting about the fake stuff, but even just simply like, who am I, you know, I think you're right that with these things, we are getting to the point where you say, you know, it's like in a conversation with chat GPT, you'll say things like, I want you to, like as if it's a person, but then yeah, it's not got that identity of actually having like a memory of talking to a person. So I think that is a really interesting thing, and I wondered to what extent these things matter taking the technology forward.
Yeah. So I think we always need consistency in people's roles, right? So if I know people in work-related contexts and then I suddenly see them in a very different context, it's a bit jarring, right? Because we sort of require other people to have roles to make sense of where we stand with them, right? And the same goes for how we treat technology, right? So you have different purpose for your, you know, work phone versus personal phone, or your work email, maybe your politer, I don't know, versus your personal email. And then you have this different identity on LinkedIn versus Instagram. And we accept that, right? Like the social media account doesn't actually represent who you are at work, perhaps. Depends on the person. But it is problematic when we can't always assume what kind of roles are expected. Because if I, you know, outsource my personality on Twitter to a bot because it will do a better job and hopefully it doesn't, you know, get trolled, then like, are you sure that you're seeing my tweets or the bot's tweets that sort of just kind of mimics what I say, right? I just kind of take some LLM, give it a bit of what I've done before, and then, you know, is it a version of me? Is it an extension of me because it was sort of mixed in with my own social media data? Or is it really some other entity and therefore should be classified with like a warning sign, right? This is a Minha, like 2.0, you know, like, do we really want that? Like, because that's sort of the safer way to go if we think about AI regulation.
I was thinking more about yeah, that's super interesting, but I was thinking more about the kind of, as a conversational partner, one of the things, it's always this kind of shared history about what, you know, that's the great thing about talking with real people versus talking with machines, is that like real people tend to remember what you talked about last, but that common ground, right? You know, what we talked about before, but is usually retained. Yeah,
the interesting thing though is with dementia research, of course, people don't really have the long-term memory in the same way, but they're still people, right? And then you have other markers of consistent identity. So Fuchs, F-U-C-H, like German philosopher, thinks that it's the embodied identity, right? So the way you sit on a chair, that's still you, right? You don't have this conversational memory as a person with dementia, perhaps, but your self-identity can still remain because there's this embodied knowledge of how you are in the world, right? So if we say that that's what you would accept from a person with dementia, I don't know why we can't afford that level of flexibility to machines, because we already sort of do, right? But maybe I'm on the more optimistic end. I mean, you guys can definitely disagree. I'd be grilled with philosophers for sure.
Thank you very much for this very heavy and very, very inspiring talk. You mentioned in one slide the term of shame, and I was very curious about your perspective on this wonderful yet challenging emotion, because shame is like one of these emotions which keeps us within a group, within a society. And how would you see this from a technological perspective? So like the relationship between shame and technology. So for example, what we have right now is like the question, if the lack of shame is causing this kind of toxicity in social media, for example, because people don't have this kind of, oh, there's no boundary. There's like, I don't have this kind of negative emotion. But so like, of course, us as HCI researchers, we always strive for happiness and we don't want to have these negative emotions. So I'm quite curious about your perspective on these kinds of negative boundaries.
So, I mean, I sort of lied. I did do a study with shame and guilt in my year as a PhD student, and then I never returned to it because it was too depressing.
Welcome to my life.
And there was something that went wrong in the experimental construct, but we asked people to like write about a shameful experience, and then nobody read it, but we looked at their behavioral patterns of whether or not they wanted to keep the piece of paper or throw it away, right? And then we try to measure heart rate, things like, if you ever want to do something like that, be my guest, and you can sort of be my proxy for studying shame without the shame. You know, so I think Shirley Turkle, of course, has explored that social media and technology in general actually does not allow us to have this face-to-face challenge of assessing how we make other people feel, right? I don't think it's just shame, though. Of course, it regulates us and we respond more strongly to these negative regulators, but also sort of being in awe of other people, right? Or feeling compassion for one. And that's really kind of hard to do maybe virtually, but perhaps there is a trend towards changing that. Like that's what I sort of try to do with Vincent and compassion. So if we're only talking about shame, you'd have to also look into, there's literature by Tangney in shame culture versus guilt culture, right? So certain cultures promote shame, like you have brought shame upon the family. Like, you know, one thing you do wrong is like shaming the whole family versus guilt and like guilt tripping, which apparently, at least according to her research, is trying to provide some more cooperation rather than shame that sort of is more about isolating yourself compared to the rest of the world. So it's interesting because if that is true, when we're even more isolated through technology, it's accentuating shame even more, right? So I'm not sure how to make it come the other way around, or maybe use something that is more for promoting guilt rather than shame. But then you're really comparing between sort of the two evils in a way. And then if you see emotions as all connected to one another as they are, unless you're a psychopath, you never know, right? Then you could say, well, there might be some level of shame, but you can still add a mixture of cooperation, right? You could maybe try to elicit compassion, because compassion is not always positive, right? There's the understanding of others' suffering, etc. And it is different than empathy. So if you sort of mix in different moral, emotional cues across different kind of, well, teams or social media platforms, and if the identity of the two parties involved also do not necessarily change, then you might be going somewhere. But I think it runs into the same problem that Duncan has mentioned, in that roles and identities also shift. And adding emotions on top of that makes it quite difficult to navigate.
I mean, you mentioned already, it's like the cultural differences, right? It's like the Eastern cultures, like we know it from social anxiety, Eastern social anxiety, Western social anxiety, individualism culture, and community-based cultures. And that's like, there's also this different experience of shame and guilt. And then basically it's like when they are overlapping each other. And that's like the quite interesting question when now you're introducing, when we are introducing, it's like a new actor who is actually per se, who's telling a robot that they should be ashamed of their behavior now. They should feel guilt. These kinds of things, like because of course, like you want to keep from us as human beings, like we are trained towards these emotions regulate and help us to stay in the group. But like for this new entity, it's like quite questionable or challenging to experience that.
Yeah. I guess if we do that with psychopath, we should be able to do that with machines. I mean, I don't want to make this clean comparison, right? Because psychopathy is a clearly human construct, whereas machines are sort of made to obviously be without emotions. They cannot have emotions. So a lot of the terms I'm also guilty of that we're using from our human world doesn't necessarily carry over to the machine world, in which maybe one critique of the work could be that, do these emotions actually carry over? Right? And do I need to call shame 2.0 or something for machines, right? Like, do we need to reassess the constructs we use? Because it's really not the same as, here's like this, you know, trash can on my desktop. And I know that also is related to the trash can in the real world. It's not this one-on-one interface with emotions, right? So I think that will be a big challenge. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for such a great talk. I also thought your slides were really beautiful. I like the artwork on them. I was thinking about the punishment dilemma that you've got, that we sort of seem to skip this step of blame but when we jump to punishing machines. And I was thinking about like the first order effects of punishment and then the second order effects of punishment. I'm not sure if that's the right language for it, but maybe the first order of punishment is that it stops the action from happening again. So you chuck someone in prison, break the machine, it can't do the thing again. But then like maybe the second order of punishment is this idea of the threat to future people, other people who might do it. And I feel like the second order, like that's interesting because machines might not be able to perceive what the risks of their behavior are, but you definitely could, if you destroy a machine, you could stop it from doing it again. And then with the blame thing, it really requires shame for blame to be an obstacle to doing that action again. Or I can see how blame could be more distributed across the creator of the machine versus the actual machine itself, whereas punishment could be more about like blocking something, blocking the behavior again. Is there does that spark any ideas?
So there's the whole forward looking versus backward looking responsibility there, right? Because punishment is usually looking backwards, right? Some action X must have happened for that to be punishable. And you could say the same about blame, but I think it's more flexible, right? And so, and then you can make it into more like a matrix, right? Like, so it's a forward or backward looking, but also is it in one-on-one interpersonal relationship, or is it in this group level or societal blame or punishment, right? So if we say Spot the robot dog is to blame, like, are we blaming it, the company? Like, to what extent are we enlarging our moral circle, right? So actually, the Danaher works on ethical behaviorism, in that if it displays behaviors of ethical relevance in the human world, and whether or not it actually is conscious or has a mind, it doesn't really matter. So if blame and punishment also serves the same purpose, like the effect is the same, then does it matter what the means are? I'm not sure if I'm actually answering your question though.
Well, it wasn't really a question, but that was a very interesting answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually wanted to go back to the Vincent and compassion idea, and how a robot showing an emotion, quote unquote, actually sparks that emotion perhaps in the human interacting with them. And does that actually make the robot seem more emotional in the way that you said that a robot that's perceived to be more emotional is perceived to be more agentic, like more smart? Because if that's the case, then would that perhaps solve the idea with machines not being welcome, right? So people don't want bots getting in the way because maybe they're not smart or not useful. But if they were more emotional, or if they sparked more emotion in us, would that sort of help with that situation? And is that a situation that we want to improve for the bots?
Yeah, so that's a good one indeed, right? So if you look at it positively, it depends on the day. That could be one way to go about, right? That there's a legitimate reason why socially constructed emotions with artificial behavior is acceptable, right? It just makes things smoother. It's just like asking, hey, how are you, without really caring about the answer. Like cashiers do that. Maybe not here, I don't know. In the Netherlands, they definitely don't ask this. Like, they're like, what do you want, right? So depends on the culture per se, but it could smoothen things out. But more interestingly, the second part of what you said of like, do we actually want it, right? We already do a lot of emotional labor for each other, right? So the way that you have to maybe talk with a student and be like super enthusiastic when you're not a positive person, things like that. We do a lot of emotional labor for one another. And I mean, that's sort of, the glue that kind of binds us together. And one disagreement could be that, well, it's all great, it makes things smoother, but are we adding more emotional labor on top of what we already deal with, right? Because population, human-wise, isn't decreasing. We're just getting more robot actors, on top of it as well. And then if I want to outsource my emotional labor to bots, like, let me just send a chatbot to say nice things to my students, right? Am I being a good educator, right? Like, maybe I need that because of self-care routines. It's like, oh, God, I can't bear to be enthusiastic about this lecture anymore, right? Then I might need to outsource it to a robot who will just be more amusing. So people who can afford that might be able to do so, right? Then are we going to have different classes of people who can emotionally manipulate each other in more proactive ways, right? And do we need to signal that, like, you know, Minha 2.1 with like shame level 3, like that's sort of the version you get during this lecture. I don't know, right? So as long as you honestly label it, is that okay?
Well, I wondered, should it work the other way around as well? So you can outsource your emotional labor and have it talk to your friends or your students or something, right? But if it's the other way where you want emotional labor and you don't feel like asking other people to perform that labor, should we be outsourcing that to bots?
So that's sort of the, we sometimes still get messages to Vincent. It's like it's been shut down. I don't know how they find it. It's not meant to be up and running. It was just a 2-week study. But that was where I was going at it, in that, so there's a philosopher named Kimberly Brownlee, and she talks about how, of course, in this moral community, right, do we owe one another things like meaningful relationships? Like, you know, some people will just never have one. Like, and is it so wrong that they get a robot partner? And those people exist. Like, they have, you know, marriages between a robot or VR character, right? And it's not just in Japan, you know, classic, but like guy in Michigan named Dave Cat has like robot wives, right? It's, you know, so it's a real thing. And I think it's easy to critique those people, right? But one common story is that they are people who've also been, let's say, outcasts in the human world, right? They were in abusive relationships, or they had partners who just kept on leaving them. And, you know, are we to say that, oh yes, government will definitely give you a loving partner? Like, that doesn't seem right. Same with caregiving, right? Not everybody will get the same kind of a caregiver. And, you know, should we require it? It's a privilege, right? So therefore, the argument you make is sensible. I've called it a Band-Aid solution. Of course, it's much better if we organically find partners we love and it kind of stays on for decades, or caregiving after dementia. Like, that would be all super great, but it's not realistic, and therefore robots should be allowed. Depends on the day.
We might be there. So thank you so much for really